June 2010. The last Whirlpool refrigerator rolls off the assembly line in Evansville, Indiana. A worker whose father built refrigerators here, whose grandfather built P-47 fighters in this same building, watches the line stop forever. 10,000 jobs in 1973. 600 jobs today. 0 tomorrow. The plant that once made Evansville the refrigerator capital of the world is moving to Mexico, where labor costs $5 an hour instead of $20. The man who founded this company started with $5,000 borrowed from a banker and a broken washing machine patent. He built an empire that employed a generation. His company survived the Great Depression, won World War II, defined the American middle class. Then it learned that loyalty was expensive and mercy was inefficient. 1956 to 2010, 54 years of Whirlpool in Evansville, peaked to nothing. From building half the refrigerators in America to building none. The machines that kept America's food cold were made by hands that are no longer needed. Was this capitalism working or capitalism failing? Did your family have a Whirlpool in the kitchen growing up? Or maybe someone who helped build them at that plant on Highway 41 before it went quiet? Perhaps you remember when Evansville called itself the refrigerator capital of the world. Share it in the comments. Now, let's begin. The story of the Whirlpool Evansville plant is not simply the story of a factory. It is the story of an American idea. The idea that building things with your hands could give you a life, a home, a future. It is the story of a city that called itself the refrigerator capital of the world and believed it would hold that title forever. It is the story of a company that helped win the Cold War by showing Soviet leaders what American kitchens looked like, then abandoned the workers who built those kitchens when cheaper labor beckoned from across the border. And it is the story of a young insurance salesman named Louis Upton who lost $500 in a failed business venture and turned that loss into an empire that would eventually generate $19 billion a year in revenue. Louis Upton never saw Mexico. He never heard of NAFTA. He died believing that American workers were the finest in the world, that the company he built would always need them, that the machines they operated would hum forever. He was wrong about all of it, but he was also, in his own way, the architect of everything that came after. To understand what happened in Evansville, you have to understand where it all began. Not in Indiana, but in a small town in western New York, in a family that would learn early that life offers no guarantees. Louis Cassius Upton was born in Fredonia, New York, on October 10, 1886, the eldest of 4 children in a family that knew both comfort and catastrophe. His father, Cassius Marcellus Upton, was a lawyer who had founded a small publishing business. The family was stable, the kind of American family that believed education and hard work could open any door. Then, in 1903, when Louis was 17 years old, his father was killed in a streetcar accident in Chicago. Louis took a job selling insurance policies to help support his mother and siblings while finishing his education. He graduated from Lake Forest Academy in 1908 and went to work for Commonwealth Edison in Chicago. He was persistent, the kind of young man who saw rejection as information rather than defeat. One day, he tried to sell a policy to W.S. Klein, the secretary-treasurer of Commonwealth Edison. Klein didn't buy the insurance, but he was impressed enough to offer the 22-year-old a job. Louis accepted, having no idea that this rejection would change everything. In 1908, a hardware merchant named E.C. Williams approached Upton with a proposition to start a company manufacturing home washing machines. Upton had saved $500, a significant sum for a young man supporting his family. He invested it all. The company failed almost immediately. Williams, feeling responsible, offered him a patent of his choosing as compensation. Upton chose a patent on a hand-powered washing machine. It was an odd choice, but Louis Upton saw something others didn't. He saw electricity spreading across America. He saw women spending hours every week scrubbing clothes by hand. He saw a future where machines did the work that human muscles had always done. He took the patent to his uncle, Emory Upton, a mechanic in Benton Harbor, Michigan, and asked him a simple question. Can you attach an electric motor to this? Emory could, and he did. The relationship between Louis and Emory was unusual but effective. Louis was the dreamer, the salesman, the man who could see around corners. Emory was the craftsman, the problem solver. Louis would later bring his younger brother Frederick into the business. and the three of them would create something that would outlast them all by more than a century. They worked nights and weekends, Louis commuting 100 miles each way from Chicago to oversee the work. The first 100 electric washing machines they built were sold to Federal Electric Company, a division of Commonwealth Edison. They seemed like a triumph. Then the gears started failing. Every single machine broke down. Federal Electric's president summoned the 25-year-old Louis Upton to his office and demanded a full refund. This was the moment that would define not just Louis Upton's career, but the company that would become Whirlpool. Upton didn't make excuses. He didn't blame his uncle's engineering. He recalled every machine, replaced every faulty part, and delivered them back at no charge. It was expensive, but it was also the founding of a reputation. Federal Electric was so impressed that they doubled their order. On November 11, 1911, with a $5,000 investment from a banker named Lowell Basford, Louis Upton and his uncle Emery officially founded the Upton Machine Company. Louis was 25 years old. He would spend the next 4 decades building what would become the world's largest appliance manufacturer. The Upton Machine Company grew steadily through the 1910s, but its transformation into an industrial giant came from a single relationship: Sears, Roebuck and Company. In 1916, Sears began sourcing washing machines from Upton. By 1921, they had made Upton their exclusive supplier. The arrangement was mutually beneficial, but precarious. Sears represented the vast majority of Upton's sales and could walk away at any time. But Sears had distribution networks that reached every corner of America. If you could build a machine that Sears trusted, you could put that machine in every American home. The relationship would last for over a century. Sears would sell Upton's machines under the Kenmore brand name. In kitchens across the country, Kenmore washers, dryers, refrigerators, and dishwashers, all manufactured by Whirlpool, became synonymous with American appliances. Sears got a reliable supplier of quality products. Whirlpool got access to the most powerful retail distribution network in America. The relationship was not without tension. Sears wielded enormous power over its suppliers, demanding price cuts and threatening to take their business elsewhere. Louis Upton understood the risk, but also understood that Sears was the fastest path to growth. Even today, more than 100 years after that first contract, Whirlpool still manufactures Kenmore appliances for what remains of Sears, though Sears itself filed for bankruptcy in 2018 and shrank to a shadow of its former self. In 1929, the Upton Machine Company merged with the 1900 Washer Company of Binghamton, New York. The combined entity took the name 1900 Corporation and the brand name Whirlpool. The merger gave Upton manufacturing capacity on the East Coast and a name that would become one of the most recognized in American industry. The timing was precarious. The stock market crashed just months later. But the new company proved remarkably resilient. People still needed to wash their clothes. The demand didn't disappear. It just contracted. The company maintained its workforce when competitors were laying off employees. It continued to invest in quality when competitors were cutting corners. It built a reputation for reliability that would serve it well when the economy recovered. By the time America entered World War II, the company was positioned to serve the war effort. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, American manufacturing underwent the most rapid transformation in industrial history. The entire industrial capacity of the United States was redirected toward winning the war. The 1900 Corporation converted its facilities to armament production. But Louis Upton did something that distinguished him from other wartime manufacturers. He didn't just wait for the war to end. While other executives focused entirely on military contracts, Upton assembled a team of engineers to design the next generation of washing machines. They went through 50 working models, preparing for the moment when American soldiers would come home, start families, and need the appliances that would define post-war suburban life. On August 27, 1945, exactly 1 week after VJ Day, every worker who wanted to return to the 1900 Corporation was called back to work. The company announced its new automatic washers. While competitors scrambled to retool, Upton was already manufacturing. It was the kind of foresight that built empires. The post-war years were golden for American appliance manufacturers, and no city embodied that golden age quite like Evansville, Indiana. Before the war, Evansville had been a struggling river town in southwestern Indiana, dependent on furniture manufacturing and coal mining. The Great Depression had hit hard. Factories closed. Workers left. By the late 1930s, Evansville had what one observer called a ghost-like appearance. Then came 1942, and everything changed. The United States was at war, and war required production on a scale America had never attempted. The federal government identified Evansville as suitable for a new aircraft factory, far enough from the coasts to be safe from attack, connected by river and rail to the industrial heartland, blessed with a workforce that desperately needed work. Republic Aviation would build P-47 Thunderbolts there. The P-47 was a remarkable aircraft. At over 7 tons, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built to that point. Its massive Pratt & Whitney engine generated more than 2,000 horsepower. Pilots called it the Jug because of its barrel-like fuselage, and they loved it because it brought them home when other planes wouldn't. The P-47 could absorb extraordinary punishment and keep flying. Building the P-47 required precision that most manufacturing processes of the era couldn't achieve. The Republic Aviation plant in Evansville rose to the challenge. Construction began in April 1942, and by September, just 5 months later, the first P-47 built in Evansville took to the sky for a test flight. The factory employed 5,000 workers, about half of them women. They were called the Raiderettes, and they built more than 6,000 aircraft during the war. These women came from farms and small towns across southern Indiana and western Kentucky. Many had never held an industrial job before. They learned to read blueprints, to operate drill presses, to rivet aluminum sheets together with precision. Ada McClurkin started at Republic Aviation in August 1942 at age 22. She commuted 55 miles each day from Kentucky. Mildred Harris became a supervisor, managing other aircraft inspectors. Naomi Johnson earned her restricted radio operator license and became the first woman in the region to hold that position, communicating with pilots as they tested P-47s fresh off the assembly line. The work was hard, the hours were long, and the pressure was relentless. The men flying these planes were depending on every rivet being set correctly, every weld holding true. The Raiderettes understood this and delivered. The Evansville plant earned 3 Army-Navy E awards for excellence in production, an honor awarded to fewer than 5% of eligible facilities nationwide. President Franklin D. Roosevelt visited the plant in April 1943 to watch a P-47 dive at 500 miles per hour. By 1942, Evansville factories had received more than $600 million in defense contracts, the equivalent of more than $8 billion today. Over 250 businesses produced over 300 wartime products. The city's population swelled as workers streamed in from across the region. The war remade Evansville, just as it remade America itself. When the war ended, the question became, what would happen to all that capacity? The P-47 production line shut down in September 1945. Republic Aviation had no use for a factory 1,000 miles from its Long Island headquarters. Many workers wanted to stay. They had learned skills, tasted independence, discovered they could do things they had never imagined. What they needed was someone to give them something new to build. The answer came on January 4, 1946, when International Harvester announced it was purchasing the former Republic Aviation plant for $5.6 million. The company would make refrigerators. It was an unusual move for a tractor company, but International Harvester understood that rural electrification had transformed the American countryside. Farms that had relied on iceboxes now had electricity. Millions of rural families needed refrigerators, and International Harvester already had relationships with those families through its tractor dealerships. Many workers who had built P-47 Thunderbolts returned to build refrigerators instead. The skills transferred surprisingly well. Precision assembly, quality control, working with metal and machinery. The attention to detail that had kept pilots alive in combat now kept milk cold in American kitchens. International Harvester took its appliance business seriously. The company created a mascot named Irma Harding and assembled teams of young women, gave them cars, and sent them around the Midwest, giving demonstrations at dealerships and visiting rural housewives. The marketing campaign emphasized how refrigeration could transform food preservation. By the late 1940s, International Harvester's Evansville plant was producing thousands of refrigerators every month. But International Harvester wasn't alone. Serval Incorporated made gas-powered refrigerators at a facility on East Franklin Street, units particularly popular in rural areas without reliable electricity. Seeger Refrigerator Corporation operated a plant on West Morgan Avenue. Together with International Harvester, these three companies produced more refrigerators than any other city in the world. By the late 1940s, Evansville was manufacturing 3,800 refrigerator units every day, one refrigerator every 23 seconds, around the clock. The city gave itself a nickname, the refrigerator capital of the world. In 1948, the Evansville Junior Chamber of Commerce founded a college football bowl game to celebrate the city's industrial identity, the Refrigerator Bowl. Teams would run onto the field by passing through an actual refrigerator frame while the crowd cheered. The games raised money for Camp Carson, a YMCA facility for local children. Teams came from across the country: Abilene Christian, Jacksonville State, Kent State, the University of Rhode Island. Local teams won twice. The University of Evansville Purple Aces took home the trophy in 1948 and 1949. The Refrigerator Bowl ran for 9 years, from 1948 to 1956. By the mid-1950s, attendance had declined, and Serval, one of the major sponsors, had gone out of business. The bowl game quietly ended, but for those 9 years, it represented a city proud of what it made. A city that believed making refrigerators was as worthy of recognition as anything else a community could do. The workers at these refrigerator plants earned wages that could support families. They bought homes in new subdivisions, purchased new cars, joined bowling leagues and softball teams. They sent their children to school, expecting those children to work in the same plants when they grew up. This was not an unreasonable expectation. The refrigerator factories were institutions woven into the fabric of community life as tightly as the churches and the schools. This was the American Industrial Compact. You worked hard, the company paid you fairly, and you could expect decades of stable employment. The union represented workers who earned approaching $20 an hour, enough by 1970s standards to put you solidly in the middle class. A refrigerator assembler could take a vacation. A factory hand could retire with a pension. The work was hard and conditions could be dangerous, but it was something. It was a deal that seemed to work for everyone. Then the deal started falling apart. The year 1955 marked a turning point. International Harvester had poured enormous resources into its appliance division, but the company was losing money. The refrigerator business required different expertise than tractors. International Harvester's refrigeration division had accumulated $250 million in debt. The company decided to exit the appliance business entirely and sell its Evansville plant. The buyer was the Whirlpool Corporation, which had changed its name from 1900 Corporation in 1949. Whirlpool paid $5.6 million, exactly what International Harvester had paid for the former aircraft factory a decade earlier. For the workers, the change in ownership seemed like a positive development. Whirlpool was growing rapidly and committed to appliances. In that same year, Whirlpool also acquired the Seeger Refrigerator Company and RCA's air conditioner and cooking range lines. By 1957, Whirlpool had introduced its first complete line of home appliances, 12 types of machines and 150 models. Lewis Upton had retired from the presidency in 1949, passing leadership to Elisha Bud Gray II, but he remained involved as chairman of the board. On October 9, 1952, the day before his 66th birthday, Lewis Upton was riding in a car to a business lunch near Niles, Michigan. He looked out the window and remarked, "It's a beautiful day." Minutes later, he suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He died that evening at Powhatan Hospital. The next day, the St. Joseph Herald Press published an editorial calling him the first citizen of St. Joseph and of the greater Twin City area. He had transformed a $500 loss into an industrial empire. He had insisted on quality when cutting corners would have been easier. He had planned for peace during wartime, and he had died believing that the company he built would endure. 4 years after Lewis Upton's death, Whirlpool achieved something that would cement its place in Cold War history. The year was 1959, and the Cold War was at its most intense. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik. Fidel Castro had seized power in Cuba. The world seemed to teeter on the edge of nuclear annihilation. In this atmosphere, the United States and Soviet Union agreed to host cultural exhibitions in each other's countries. The American National Exhibition opened in July at Sokolniki Park in Moscow, featuring products from more than 450 American companies. Vice President Richard Nixon traveled to serve as host. This was not an exhibit about factories and machinery. It was about consumer goods, about the everyday luxuries that Americans took for granted and Soviets could only dream of. There were Pepsi-Cola samples, Polaroid cameras, color television sets, and most memorably, 3 model kitchens: a futuristic Whirlpool Miracle Kitchen, a General Mills kitchen, and a General Electric kitchen. Nixon escorted Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev through the exhibition, and what happened next became one of the defining moments of the Cold War. Khrushchev was already furious about a congressional resolution recognizing Captive Nations Week. Standing in the model kitchen, Nixon and Khrushchev engaged in an impromptu debate about the relative merits of capitalism and communism. Nixon pointed to the appliances surrounding them and argued that an American steelworker earning $3 an hour could afford all of it. He claimed the model home cost only $14,000, well within reach of average working families. Khrushchev was skeptical, but clearly engaged. He dismissed some gadgets as unnecessary, sarcastically asking, "Don't you have a machine that puts food into the mouth and pushes it down?" The debate grew heated. Fingers pointed. Voices rose. Nixon warned that Khrushchev's constant threats about nuclear missiles could lead to war. But then, as if remembering the cameras were rolling, both men stepped back. "Let's compete," Khrushchev finally said. "Who can produce the most goods for the people? That system is better, and it will win." The kitchen debate was broadcast on American television the next day. Nixon was hailed as a hero. The appliances in that kitchen, many produced by Whirlpool, became symbols of American prosperity and technological superiority. Robert Elton Brooker, who had become president of Whirlpool in 1957, presided over the Whirlpool kitchen at the exhibition. The company had helped prove that American capitalism delivered material abundance that communism couldn't match. It was perhaps the proudest moment in Whirlpool's history, and it raised a question that wouldn't be answered for another 50 years. If these appliances were so central to American identity, what would it mean when the factories that built them moved to Mexico? Through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, the Evansville plant hummed along. Refrigerators rolled off the assembly line by the thousands. The workforce grew. The plant operated. Around the clock, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. The demand for American appliances seemed limitless. By 1973, the plant employed nearly 10,000 workers, its peak employment. Hourly wages approached $20, equivalent to more than $70 an hour today. Workers bought boats, built additions onto their houses, took their families to Florida, sent their kids to college. The American dream was not an abstraction in Evansville. It was a paycheck, a pension, the knowledge that you could build things with your hands and earn a decent life. But even as the plant reached its peak, forces were gathering that would eventually destroy it. The 1973 energy crisis sent oil prices soaring. The economy slipped into recession. Inflation rose. Interest rates climbed. The housing industry slumped badly. New home construction fell by nearly half between 1973 and 1975. And if people weren't buying new homes, they weren't buying new refrigerators either. Whirlpool dealers began liquidating inventories. The company had to lay off over 1/3 of its workforce nationwide. In 1974, workers at the Evansville plant went on strike. The strike lasted 4 months, a brutal standoff that tested the resolve of both sides. Families burned through savings. Some lost homes. When the strike ended, the plant resumed operations, but something had shifted. The relationship between company and workers now carried an edge of mutual suspicion. In 1983, as part of a company-wide initiative to reduce costs, Whirlpool closed the plant's compressor facilities permanently. The compressors had been a source of pride, but now they would be made elsewhere. The Evansville plant would continue assembling refrigerators, but it would no longer manufacture every component. It was a small step, but it established a precedent. The 1980s and 1990s brought intensifying competition from foreign manufacturers, particularly from Asia. Korean companies like Samsung and LG entered the American market with refrigerators that were cheaper than anything American workers could make. Chinese manufacturers followed. The quality gap that had once favored American products narrowed and then disappeared. By the 1990s, a refrigerator made in South Korea was as reliable as one made in Indiana, and it cost significantly less. Meanwhile, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was signed in 1993 and took effect in 1994. The agreement eliminated most tariffs between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Politicians from both parties supported it. President George H.W. Bush negotiated it. A Democratic-controlled Congress passed it. President Bill Clinton signed it into law. They were told by economists that free trade would lift all boats. What NAFTA actually did was make it economically rational for American companies to move manufacturing to Mexico, where workers earned a fraction of American wages and environmental regulations were laxer. The appliance industry was perfectly positioned to exploit this opportunity. A refrigerator assembled in Monterey could be trucked to Dallas in a day. Whirlpool didn't move to Mexico immediately. The company closed plants in Newton, Iowa, Searcy, Arkansas, and Herron, Illinois first. But even as Whirlpool shed American workers, the Evansville plant held on. Workers there believed they were different. They were the refrigerator capital of the world. They had built the appliances that won the Cold War. Surely Whirlpool wouldn't abandon them. On August 28, 2009, Whirlpool Corporation issued a press release announcing changes to its North American manufacturing operations. The timing was deliberate, a Friday in late August, when stories are buried under weekend inattention. The language was corporate and bloodless. To reduce excess capacity and improve costs, the decision was made to consolidate production within our existing North American manufacturing facilities. What this meant was that the Evansville plant would close. Production would shift to existing facilities in Iowa and to a new expansion in Monterrey, Mexico. Approximately 1,100 workers would lose their jobs. Al Holliday, Vice President of North American Manufacturing Operations, called it a difficult but necessary decision. The announcement hit Evansville like a bomb. For more than 50 years, the Whirlpool plant had been a fixture of the community. The union, IUECWA, Local 84,808, represented about 900 of the workers. Their president, Darrell Collins, captured the mood. Americans are sick of companies turning a blind eye to what is happening out there. We've got 1,100 people who are going to be out of a job. But Whirlpool wasn't listening. The company was building a $55 million expansion in Apodaca, just outside Monterey. Construction began in October 2009. The expansion would include equipment relocated from the closing Indiana plant. The machines they had operated would make the same refrigerators in Mexico. Only the workers would change. The fight to save the plant was fierce but ultimately futile. The union launched a Shame on Whirlpool campaign. They bought billboard space along Interstate 94 near Whirlpool's headquarters. They filed unfair labor practice charges after a company vice president warned workers that participating in protests will only hamper employees when they look for future jobs. The warning backfired, generating national media attention. On February 26, 2010, between 2,000 and 4,000 people marched to the doors of the Whirlpool plant. AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka joined them. Union members came from as far away as North Carolina. The marchers delivered petitions demanding that Whirlpool keep the production jobs in Evansville. But petitions don't change corporate spreadsheets. The arguments for moving production to Mexico were, from a purely financial perspective, compelling. Mexican workers earned a fraction of American wages. Benefits were cheaper. Environmental regulations were less stringent. NAFTA ensured that refrigerators produced in Mexico could enter the United States duty-free. Whirlpool spokeswoman Jody Lau explained that the Evansville plant was uncompetitive from a cost standpoint. This was true as far as it went. What it didn't acknowledge was that Whirlpool had been profitable throughout the period. This wasn't a company on the verge of bankruptcy. This was a company choosing to increase its profit margins by abandoning the workers who had built it. There was an additional irony. Whirlpool had accepted federal stimulus funds during the economic crisis. American taxpayers were subsidizing a company that was using their money to ship American jobs to Mexico. As IUECWA President Jim Clark put it, Whirlpool is a bad corporate citizen who is twisting this country's desire to reduce energy usage and using it to export jobs. The first layoffs came in March 2010 when Whirlpool ended its second production shift. About 450 workers lost their jobs. They cleaned out their lockers, turned in their badges, and walked out into an economy that had no use for their skills. The Great Recession was still grinding on. Unemployment in Indiana was approaching 10%. The remaining 600 workers knew they were next. They came to work every day knowing that each refrigerator they assembled brought them closer to unemployment. Some workers grew bitter. Others tried to maintain their professionalism. Bill Robertson, a 16-year veteran, told reporters, "Our country must stop exporting U.S. jobs. We've got people here who need work." Some workers applied for positions at other Whirlpool facilities, but those jobs were hundreds or thousands of miles away. Others enrolled in retraining programs funded by trade adjustment assistance. But retraining for what? Former Whirlpool employee Natalie Ford told PBS that after the plant closed, her husband, who had also worked at Whirlpool, took a job at an automotive plant, earning about 20% less. She was working part-time at a restaurant and collecting unemployment, bringing home about half what she had earned before. On June 25, 2010, the production line stopped. The last refrigerators rolled off, were loaded onto trucks, and shipped to warehouses. 600 workers punched out for the final time. They gathered in the parking lot, some hugging, some crying, some just standing in silence. Many had spent their entire adult lives in this building. A contractor began removing equipment and furniture from the plant. The machines were loaded onto trucks bound for Mexico, where workers earning a few dollars an hour would operate them. Tom Webster, Whirlpool's human resources director, told reporters that the plant's future hadn't been decided. But everyone knew what that meant. The closure didn't mark the complete end of Whirlpool's presence in Evansville. The company maintained a refrigeration product development center at the site, employing about 300 engineers and researchers. For a while, there was hope that at least these jobs would remain. Then, on August 13, 2012, Whirlpool announced that the development center would close by the end of 2014. The remaining 300 jobs would move to Benton Harbor, Michigan. Evansville Mayor Lloyd Winnick admitted to reporters, "I think a lot of us thought that once the manufacturing jobs left, it wouldn't be long before the research development team would leave also." The economic impact on Evansville was significant but not catastrophic. The city was not a one-company town. Other manufacturers remained. Toyota operated a plant in nearby Princeton. The healthcare sector expanded. The University of Southern Indiana grew. The city adapted, as American cities have always adapted. But adaptation is not the same as recovery. The jobs that replaced the Whirlpool jobs paid less. The average weekly wage in Evansville remains below the national average, about $1,100 compared to the national average of more than $1,400. A factory worker who had expected to retire with a pension now faced the prospect of working until death, one medical emergency away from financial ruin. The mathematics of middle-class life had changed. In 2000, before the worst of the manufacturing decline, Evansville's manufacturing sector employed about 32,000 workers. By 2011, that number had fallen to approximately 21,000, a loss of more than 11,000 jobs in a single decade. Today, the Evansville metropolitan area has a poverty rate of about 18%, significantly higher than the national average. Median household income hovers around $50,000, below state and national figures. What happened to the Whirlpool plant itself? The buildings still stand on Highway 41 North, south of St. George Road. The scale is impressive. The emptiness is devastating. For years after the closure, the site sat largely vacant, weeds growing through cracks in the concrete, windows accumulating grime. In 2014, the Kunkel Group purchased the site for $2.9 million, a fraction of what the facility had cost to build, and began dividing it into parcels for redevelopment. Some buildings found new tenants. A plastics manufacturer moved in. Sugar Steel relocated its operations there. But these new tenants employed dozens of workers, not thousands. In 2020, the Evansville Museum of Arts, History, and Science opened an exhibit on the city's refrigeration history. Tom Lawnberg, the museum's curator of history, explained, "Evansville was a real heart of manufacturing here, and refrigeration is a big part of that. At one point in the middle of the 20th century, we talked about ourselves as the refrigerator capital of the world." The exhibit featured artifacts from Serval, Seeger, International Harvester, and Whirlpool. It was a memorial to an economy that no longer existed. The story of the Whirlpool Evansville plant cannot be understood without understanding the broader transformation of American manufacturing. This is not a story about one factory or one company or one city. It is a story about America itself, about what we chose to become and what we gave up in the process. Between 1979 and 2019, the United States lost more than 7 million manufacturing jobs, roughly the population of Arizona. These were jobs that paid living wages, provided benefits, offered security and dignity. They were jobs that allowed people without college degrees to join the middle class. And now they're gone. Some of this loss was due to automation, but automation doesn't explain everything. Much of the job loss was due to trade, to the relocation of production to countries where labor was cheaper. NAFTA alone, according to the Economic Policy Institute, eliminated about 1 million net American jobs in its first decade. The jobs it destroyed paid better than the jobs it created. The appliance industry was particularly affected. Before NAFTA, companies like Whirlpool had begun moving some production to Mexico, but the agreement accelerated the trend dramatically. The workers who lost their jobs rarely found equivalent employment. They took pay cuts, they lost benefits, they watched their communities decline. The defenders of free trade argued that these costs were outweighed by benefits to consumers. Lower prices at the store, more choices, greater efficiency. Mohammed Qayyum, an economist at the University of Southern Indiana, explained the logic. We benefit because of a range of things that happen, including more products, greater quality, lower prices. He acknowledged that the benefits were diffuse while the costs were concentrated. But there's a problem with the free trade argument. The promised benefits never fully materialized for displaced workers. The Center for Economic and Policy Research calculated that trade-related wage losses outweigh the gains in cheaper goods for the vast majority of American workers. Workers without college degrees, about 58% of the workforce, have likely lost an amount equal to more than 12% of their wages under NAFTA-style trade. That means a net loss of more than $3,000 per year for a worker earning the median wage. The refrigerators got cheaper, but the workers who used to make them got poorer. Whirlpool, for its part, continued to thrive. The company reported annual revenues of approximately $19 billion in recent years. It employs about 60,000 workers worldwide, with roughly 15,000 in the United States. The Monterey facility that absorbed production from Evansville expanded repeatedly. In 2023, Whirlpool announced a $160 million expansion of its plant in Ramos Arizpe, creating approximately 1,000 new jobs. Mexican jobs, not American ones. Today, Whirlpool operates 3 manufacturing plants in Mexico. These plants produce refrigerators, washing machines, stoves, and other appliances, 90 to 95% of which are exported to the United States and Canada. Mexican workers now make the same products that Evansville workers once made. What does it mean that the appliances displayed at the kitchen debate, the symbols of American capitalist superiority, are now largely manufactured in Mexico? What does it mean that Nixon's steelworker has been replaced by a Mexican worker earning a few dollars a day? What does it mean that the competition between capitalism and communism was won by capitalism, and then capitalism decided it didn't need the workers who helped win it? The Cold War was supposed to prove that capitalism delivered prosperity to ordinary workers better than communism. And for a while, it did. The post-war American economy created a vast middle class of factory workers who could afford homes, cars, vacations, and college educations for their children. This was the market working as it was supposed to work. But then capitalism evolved. It figured out that it didn't need American workers to deliver profits to American shareholders. It figured out that Mexican workers, Chinese workers, Vietnamese workers could build the same products for less. The American worker who was supposed to represent capitalism's triumph became an obstacle to capitalism's profits. The workers were expendable. The Cold War had merely disguised that fact for a few decades. There's a plane in Evansville now, a P-47 Thunderbolt named Hoosier Spirit II. It was built at the Republic Aviation Plant in 1944, the same facility that would later become the Whirlpool factory. After the war, the plane served in the Venezuelan Air Force, then passed through private collections before returning to Indiana in 2020. The Evansville P-47 Foundation purchased it as a symbol of the city's contribution to World War II. In 2021, Indiana Governor Eric Holcomb signed House Bill 1197, naming Hoosier Spirit II as Indiana's state aircraft. Today it sits in the Evansville Wartime Museum, about a mile from where it was manufactured. Visitors can see photographs of the Raiderettes at work and read about the 6,242 Thunderbolts the city built. They can stand next to Hoosier Spirit II and imagine the pilots who flew planes like this into combat, trusting their lives to the workmanship of Evansville's workers. The museum celebrates Evansville's role in the war effort, the transformation from Depression-era ghost town to industrial powerhouse. What it doesn't quite capture is what happened after. The same hands that built fighter planes built refrigerators. The same skills that won a war built an economy, and then the refrigerators left. The Whirlpool Evansville plant was not unique. Across America, factories have closed and communities have struggled to adapt. Bethlehem Steel employed 300,000 workers at its peak. It filed for bankruptcy in 2001 and shut down entirely in 2003. The Packard Motor Plant in Detroit has sat abandoned since 1958. Youngstown steel mills employed tens of thousands of workers. When they closed in the 1970s and 1980s, the city lost half its population and never recovered. Each closure follows a similar pattern. Decades of profitable operation, pressure from foreign competition, corporate decisions to move production elsewhere, workers left behind. American manufacturing built American prosperity, and then American companies decided they didn't need American workers to maintain their profits. In Evansville, life goes on. The city has diversified its economy, though the diversification has come at a cost. Healthcare employs more people than manufacturing now, but healthcare jobs don't offer the same pathway to middle-class prosperity that factory jobs once did. The University of Southern Indiana and the University of Evansville produce graduates who leave for jobs in larger cities. This is the brain drain that afflicts so many mid-sized American cities. New industries have emerged: logistics, professional services, healthcare technology. Amazon operates fulfillment centers in the region. The abandoned industrial sites are slowly being redeveloped, turned into distribution centers that employ fewer workers at lower wages than the factories they replaced. The question that lingers over Evansville, and over every American community that has lost its industrial base, is whether any of this was inevitable. Was globalization an unstoppable force? Or were there choices made, political decisions enacted, corporate strategies pursued that could have gone differently? Trade agreements are not natural phenomena like earthquakes or hurricanes. They are policy choices negotiated by governments, shaped by the people who have power. NAFTA didn't happen by accident. Politicians in both parties supported it. They were told it would create jobs. Maybe they believed it. Maybe they just listened to the lobbyists, who wrote the checks. The workers in Evansville were told to be patient, to adapt, to accept that their sacrifice was necessary for the greater good. 25 years later, the greater good looks an awful lot like corporate profit margins. Lewis Upton died believing that quality mattered, that treating workers fairly was not just morally right, but economically smart. He recalled faulty washing machines at his own expense because he believed that reputation was worth more than short-term profit. He planned for peace during wartime because he believed in a future where American workers would build the products that American families needed. The company he built has prospered beyond anything he could have imagined, but it has done so by abandoning the principles he established. The machines still hum, the refrigerators still roll off assembly lines, but the hands that touch them now earn a fraction of what American hands once earned. This is not a story about bad people making bad decisions. The executives at Whirlpool were following the logic of the system they operated in. They did what capitalism incentivized them to do. The question is whether a system that produces these outcomes is a system that Americans should want. The site on Highway 41 still stands. The buildings haven't been demolished. They're just empty, or mostly empty, waiting for someone to find a use for them. Drive past on a summer evening, and you can almost imagine the shift change, the parking lot filling with pickup trucks, the workers streaming toward their stations. You can almost hear the assembly line humming. Almost. The reality is silence, empty parking lots, locked gates, grass growing through cracks in the asphalt. The Evansville Wartime Museum is open Thursdays through Sundays. The Hoosier spirit, too, is there, polished and preserved, a reminder of what this city built when building things mattered. Everyone in Evansville knows what came after. They lived it. They're still living. Whirlpool Corporation celebrates its history on its website. There are timelines and milestones, photos of founders and factories. The kitchen debate gets a mention. What doesn't get mentioned is what happened to the workers who built those kitchens, those refrigerators, those symbols of American prosperity. They've been written out of the story. If you're in Evansville, drive out to Highway 41 sometime. Look at the buildings. Think about what they used to mean. Think about 10,000 workers making appliances that went into every American home. Think about a city that believed in itself so completely it couldn't imagine believing in anything else. Then drive home and open your refrigerator. Check the label, see where it was made, and ask yourself whether this is what Louis Upton had in mind when he took a $500 loss and turned it into an empire. Ask yourself whether this is what Nixon meant when he told Khrushchev that American workers could afford the American dream. The machines still run, the refrigerators still work. They keep your food cold. They hum quietly in the night. But something essential has been lost. The connection between the people who make things and the people who use them, between the workers and the communities they support, between the idea of America and the reality of what America has become. The Whirlpool plant in Evansville made refrigerators for 54 years. It employed generations of workers. It helped win the Cold War. It represented everything that American manufacturing could be, and then, one day in 2010, it stopped. The refrigerators are still being made. They're just not being made here anymore. And in that small fact lies a tragedy that encompasses millions of American workers, thousands of American communities, and an entire American way of life that we chose to abandon.